Daniel had always believed that traveling to another planet would feel dramatic. He imagined heroic arrivals, alien music echoing through enormous spaceports, and perhaps someone announcing his presence with unnecessary enthusiasm. Instead, his arrival on Arien had been strangely ordinary. The shuttle doors opened, the air smelled faintly like metal and sweet spices, and a woman with long, elegant ears held up a small glowing sign with his name on it. That woman was Vessa. At first glance, she looked almost human. Her posture was relaxed, her dark clothing practical, and her expression calm in the way of someone who understood the city around her very well. Only her ears, long and gracefully pointed, hinted that Daniel was definitely not on Earth anymore. "You are Daniel," she said. Daniel nodded, adjusting the strap of his travel bag. "And you must be the person responsible for making sure I don't accidentally insult your entire civilization within the first hour." Vessa studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I will do my best. Though our civilization has survived meteor storms, political revolutions, and 3 different attempts at edible architecture, your words are unlikely to be the most dangerous thing today." That was the moment Daniel decided he liked her. The city of Leth spread out beneath enormous curved towers that shimmered softly in the sunlight of Arian's pale blue star. Thin transport lanes glided through the air like quiet rivers of light, carrying floating vehicles between districts. Markets filled the streets below, alive with colors Daniel could barely name. Vessa led him through the crowds with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these streets her entire life. "First rule of the market," she said, "if a fruit glows, ask before eating it." "That sounds like a rule someone created after a very unfortunate experience," Daniel said. "Several unfortunate experiences." Daniel looked around with wide curiosity. Floating stalls hovered slightly above the ground, their magnetic supports humming quietly. Merchants displayed objects that ranged from tiny hovering insects made of glass to tools that looked suspiciously like they might repair spacecraft. He pointed at one of the stalls. "That looks like a plasma engine component." "It is," Vessa said casually. "For sale? In a fruit market?" The merchant overheard him and raised a hand proudly. "Multi-purpose district." Daniel nodded slowly. "Of course. Fruit, spices, and starship engines. Perfectly logical." They continued walking. Vessa occasionally explained the purpose of certain structures or traditions, but she never sounded like a rehearsed tour guide. Instead, she spoke like someone who genuinely enjoyed seeing the city through fresh eyes. Daniel had many fresh eyes. "That building," he said at one point, pointing toward a massive statue in the center of a plaza, "looks like a politician trying very hard to appear wise." Vessa glanced at the statue. The stone figure stood with a dramatic cape flowing behind him, and one arm raised toward the sky. "Yes," she said calmly, "that was exactly his intention." Daniel laughed. "On Earth, we usually wait until politicians are dead before we build statues pretending they were impressive. Here we sometimes build them while they are still alive," Vessa replied. "It encourages better behavior." "Does it work?" "Not particularly." They walked deeper into the city where the streets narrowed into vibrant market corridors. Lantern-like devices floated overhead, shifting colors slowly as if reacting to the mood of the crowd. Vendors called out to passing customers while small hovering drones carried baskets of goods between stalls. Daniel paused beside a vendor selling spiral-shaped pastries that emitted faint steam. "What are those?" The vendor proudly offered one. Vessa tilted her head slightly. "You may try it if you wish." Daniel accepted the pastry carefully. "You said glowing food requires permission. This one isn't glowing." "That is usually a good sign." He took a bite. The flavor exploded across his tongue, sweet, spicy, and slightly electric. Daniel blinked several times. "Is it supposed to tingle like that?" he asked. "Yes." "Good," he said quickly, "because for a moment I thought my mouth had joined a power grid." Vessa laughed softly. They continued through the market, weaving through clusters of citizens and hovering carts. Occasionally people glanced at Vessa with curious expressions, though Daniel assumed she was simply a familiar local face. At one stall he pointed at a display of long decorative cloaks. "Why does every statue in this city wear a cape?" he asked. Vessa looked at the cloaks thoughtfully. "Historically," she said with absolute seriousness, "dramatic capes were believed to improve leadership." Daniel stared at her. You're joking. I am not. Capes improve leadership? It creates the illusion of wind, she explained calmly. Wind suggests movement. Movement suggests progress. Daniel laughed loudly enough that several nearby merchants turned to look at him. That might be the most honest explanation of politics I've ever heard. Vessa seemed pleased by that. As they stepped into a wider plaza filled with music and drifting lanterns, Daniel stretched his arms and breathed in the unfamiliar air. I have to say, he said, this is already the best tour I've ever had. Vessa glanced at him. Even with the mildly electrified pastries? Especially because of them. She smiled again, though for a brief moment her gaze drifted across the surrounding crowd as if quietly measuring something. Daniel didn't notice. He was far too busy examining a floating device shaped like a cube that appeared to be arguing with its owner. And somewhere in the city around them, unseen by the wandering tourist, several quiet guards kept their distance, while making sure their queen remained safe during her afternoon walk. The deeper Daniel and Vessa moved into the city, the more the streets of Leth seemed to unfold like layers of a living machine. Markets blended into narrow corridors lined with tall structures that curved upward like metallic trees, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns of light. Small transport drones drifted through the air, carrying parcels, tools, and occasionally what looked suspiciously like sleeping animals inside transparent pods. Daniel slowed near one of the pods as it floated past. Is that a pet delivery service? He asked. Vessa followed his gaze. Inside the pod, a furry creature with 6 tiny legs was curled into a comfortable ball, snoring softly. Yes, she said. That one appears to be a lunar sandhopper. Daniel watched the pod drift away. It looks like a loaf of bread with legs. That description is surprisingly accurate. They turned into a narrow passage where the ground beneath their feet shimmered faintly. The surface was made of a smooth alloy that seemed to shift its texture slightly as people walked across it. Daniel looked down suspiciously. Is the floor supposed to move? It adjusts for comfort, Vessa replied. Comfort? Yes. Daniel stomped once. The ground responded with a faint ripple. So the city has a nervous system. In a manner of speaking, Daniel scratched his head. On Earth, our sidewalks barely manage to stay flat. That sounds inefficient. You have no idea. They continued walking until the passage opened into a wider square filled with suspended gardens. Thin platforms floated several meters above the ground, each one covered in bright plants that glowed softly in shades of blue and silver. Water drifted through the air between them in thin streams held together by invisible fields. Daniel stopped completely. Okay, he said slowly. This might be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Vessa watched his reaction with quiet amusement. It is one of the older districts of the city, she said. Older? Daniel pointed upward. Your old neighborhoods have floating gardens and anti-gravity rivers. We upgraded the irrigation system a few centuries ago. Daniel folded his arms. Of course you did. A small floating sphere drifted near them, projecting a soft beam of light onto the plants while making faint humming sounds. Daniel leaned closer. What does that one do? It monitors plant health. The sphere rotated toward him. Daniel waved awkwardly. Hello. The sphere hummed louder, then drifted away. Did it just judge me? He asked. It may have, Vessa said calmly. They sat briefly on the edge of a low platform, while a group of children ran past chasing a tiny hovering drone that zigzagged through the air like an excited insect. Daniel watched them with a smile. You know, he said, I expected alien cities to feel alien. And this does not? Oh, it definitely does, Daniel replied, but in a comfortable way, like visiting a future version of home. Vessa tilted her head slightly. That is a very generous interpretation. Well, Daniel continued, except for the pastry that nearly turned my mouth into a power station. That is considered a mild flavor. Daniel looked at her with concern. Remind me never to try your spicy food. A soft wind moved through the square, carrying the distant sound of music from another part of the market. Above them, a transport craft glided silently between towers. As they stood to continue walking, Daniel noticed something odd. 2 armored figures stood at the far edge of the square. They were clearly security personnel, though their uniforms were far more advanced than anything Daniel had seen since arriving. Their armor reflected the light of the floating gardens, and small scanning devices moved across the area. Daniel nudged Vessa slightly. "Are those guards watching us?" Vessa glanced briefly toward them. "City security patrols this district often." "Are they always that interested in your tours?" "They are interested in everything." Daniel shrugged. "Fair enough." They moved into another street where vendors sold mechanical trinkets and small hovering gadgets. One stall displayed a row of metallic birds that occasionally flapped their wings and sang soft digital melodies. Daniel picked one up. The bird looked at him. Daniel looked back. "Please tell me this one doesn't explode." "It is a music companion," Vessa said. The bird chirped loudly. Daniel jumped. "Okay, that's louder than expected." The vendor laughed. "First time?" "Yes," Daniel admitted. "On my planet, birds usually require food and patience. These ones apparently require ear protection." Vessa smiled faintly as Daniel carefully placed the bird back on the stall. As they walked away, Daniel noticed that some citizens gave Vessa curious looks. Not fearful exactly, but respectful. One merchant quickly stepped aside as they passed. Daniel frowned slightly. "You must be very well known around here," he said. "Perhaps. That's impressive for a tour guide. I have been around the city for a long time." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That explains it." They reached another open market where the air was filled with the scent of spices and roasted vegetables. Hovering lanterns drifted slowly overhead like lazy stars. Daniel stretched his arms again. "I have to admit," he said, "this planet is far more interesting than the travel guide suggested." "What did the guide say?" "That Arien was culturally rich and technologically advanced." "That sounds accurate." "Yes," Daniel said, looking around at the glowing markets and floating platforms. "But they forgot to mention the walking sidewalks, judgmental gardening drones, and weaponized pastries." Vessa laughed quietly again. For a moment her eyes scanned the surrounding crowd, noticing details Daniel never saw. The subtle shift of a guard's position, the quiet nod of recognition from a passing citizen, the careful distance maintained by those who understood exactly who walked among them. Daniel, however, was still studying a stall that sold glowing cubes, which appeared to be arguing with each other. "Vessa," he said. "Yes? If one of those cubes starts following me home, should I be worried?" "That depends." "On what?" "Whether it wins the argument." By the time they reached the central district of Leth, Daniel had stopped trying to predict what he might see next. Predicting anything on this planet seemed impossible. The streets widened into grand avenues lined with tall structures that curved like enormous silver leaves, reflecting sunlight in gentle waves. Above them, transport lanes shimmered faintly as quiet vehicles glided across the sky. Daniel walked with the relaxed curiosity of someone who had decided to simply enjoy the absurdity of it all. "So," he said, glancing at Vessa, "what part of the city are we in now?" "The Central Market District." Daniel looked around. This market was far larger than the others. Thousands of people moved through the wide plaza between rows of floating stalls and tall columns that projected soft beams of light upward into the sky. Musicians played strange instruments that created layered sounds somewhere between music and wind. At the center of the plaza stood a massive structure that resembled a tree made of crystal metal. Platforms spiraled around it, connected by hovering walkways. Daniel pointed upward. "That building looks like someone tried to design architecture while slightly intoxicated." Vessa looked up at it calmly. "It houses the city council archives." "That explains it," Daniel said. "Important decisions clearly require dramatic buildings." They moved deeper into the plaza where vendors called out to passing crowds. One merchant displayed small hovering spheres that projected miniature galaxies inside their surfaces. Daniel stopped immediately. "Oh, that is extremely dangerous." "Dangerous?" Vessa asked. "Yes, because if I buy one of those, I will spend the next 3 hours staring at it." He picked one up. Inside the glass sphere, tiny stars rotated slowly around a glowing center. Daniel turned it in his hand. "Does it do anything?" "It is decorative." "That's disappointing," he said. "I was hoping it could also make coffee." The merchant frowned slightly. "Coffee?" Daniel waved a hand. "Never mind." It's a very Earth thing. They returned the sphere and continued walking through the center of the plaza. The crowd thickened around them as more people entered the district from surrounding streets. Daniel watched the flow of citizens moving in every direction. Your planet really enjoys markets. They are important places, Vessa said. On Earth, they're important too, Daniel replied. But most of ours don't involve floating engines, glowing fruit, and small, argumentative cubes. Vessa smiled faintly. They stepped into the open heart of the plaza. For a moment, Daniel simply admired the enormous space. Lanterns drifted slowly through the air overhead, while thin streams of water flowed through invisible channels between sections of the square. Then something changed. The music stopped. It wasn't sudden at first. One instrument faded, then another. Daniel frowned slightly. He noticed a merchant nearby stop speaking mid-sentence. A group of shoppers paused in place. A hovering transport drone slowed, as if waiting for instructions. The crowd was becoming quiet. Daniel looked around. Did something happen? He asked. Vessa didn't answer. A woman standing near them suddenly lowered her head. Then she knelt. Daniel blinked. Across the plaza, another person knelt. Then another. Within seconds, the movement spread like a silent wave through the square. Hundreds of citizens dropped to their knees, their heads bowed toward the center of the plaza. Daniel looked behind him quickly. Is there someone important coming? No one was there. He turned to the other side. The entire plaza was kneeling. Daniel's brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Okay, he said slowly. Either I accidentally activated some kind of ceremonial protocol, or I just became emperor of something. No one answered. He turned toward Vessa. She was standing very still. Her posture had changed. The relaxed guide who had joked about pastries and capes seemed to have vanished. In her place stood someone calm, composed, and quietly powerful. Daniel stared at her. Vessa, he whispered. She looked at the kneeling citizens around them, her expression thoughtful. Daniel glanced at the crowd again. Hundreds of people remained bowed. He leaned closer to her. Vessa, I feel like I missed a very important cultural briefing. Still, she said nothing. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Did I insult someone again? A nearby merchant slowly lowered his head even further. Daniel pointed at himself. I swear I didn't mean to start a religious event. Finally, Vessa spoke. Her voice was calm, but something about it carried a quiet authority that seemed to travel through the air. You may rise. The words moved across the plaza like a soft command. One by one, citizens began standing again. No one spoke. Many avoided looking directly at the pair standing in the center of the square. Daniel watched the crowd return to motion, though the atmosphere felt different now. Quieter, more careful. He turned back toward Vessa with growing confusion. Okay, he said slowly. You definitely need to explain that. Vessa looked at him. For a brief moment, the same amused warmth returned to her expression, but now Daniel noticed something he hadn't seen before. The way nearby guards stood perfectly still, the respectful distance the crowd kept, the subtle attention of everyone around them. His eyes widened slightly. He pointed at her. Vessa, yes? Why does everyone act like you're... He stopped mid-sentence, because suddenly the idea forming in his mind seemed both ridiculous and strangely possible. Daniel stared at her for several seconds. Then he groaned quietly. Oh no! Daniel kept staring at Vessa as if the universe had just quietly rearranged itself around him without permission. Oh no, he repeated softly. Vessa folded her hands behind her back and looked at him with an expression that was both calm and slightly apologetic. Daniel slowly glanced around the plaza again. People were standing now, but they were giving the two of them a very noticeable amount of space. Conversations had resumed, but they were quieter, more careful. A few individuals stole curious glances toward Daniel, as if he had suddenly become part of a story no one had expected to witness. He leaned closer to Vessa. Please tell me I'm misunderstanding something, he whispered. That depends, she replied gently. On what? On what you believe is happening. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. Okay, he said, thinking out loud. Possibility 1, this city has extremely enthusiastic street theater. Vessa said nothing. Possibility 2, I accidentally stepped into a ceremonial area and everyone is politely pretending not to panic. Still nothing. Daniel slowly lowered his hands and looked directly into her eyes. Possibility 3, he said carefully. You are someone very important. Vessa held his gaze for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Important, like head of tourism important? No. Mayor important? No. Daniel squinted. Military commander? No. He crossed his arms. Okay, I'm running out of normal explanations. A faint smile appeared on Vessa's face. That is understandable. Daniel gestured toward the surrounding plaza. People don't drop to their knees in the middle of a market because a tour guide is having a good day. That would be unusual. Daniel pointed at her again. You said you may rise like someone who expected people to listen. They did. Yes, Daniel said. That's the concerning part. A pair of armored guards appeared quietly at the edge of the plaza, keeping a respectful distance. Their posture was attentive but not aggressive. Daniel noticed them. Oh, good, he muttered. Now the futuristic soldiers are here too. They have been here the entire time. That somehow makes it worse. Vessa looked at the plaza for a moment before returning her attention to him. I should explain. Yes, Daniel said quickly. Please do, because right now my brain is considering the possibility that I spent the afternoon joking with someone extremely powerful. Vessa took a calm breath. I am Vessa Ellerith, she said. Daniel waited. He had the feeling the sentence was not finished. Queen of Aryan. The words landed with quiet certainty. Daniel blinked. Once. Twice. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he looked up at the sky. Okay, he said softly. He looked back at her. Queen. Yes. Of the entire planet. Yes. Daniel slowly turned in a circle, looking at the vast plaza, the enormous structures, the floating transport lanes, and the citizens who were now pretending very hard not to stare. Then he turned back to her. I told the queen of an alien world that her city statues look like politicians wearing dramatic capes. Vessa nodded. You did. I also criticized the drainage system. That was a valid observation. And I made a joke about weaponized pastries. They are technically electrified. Daniel groaned. I have been giving casual urban planning advice to royalty all afternoon. That is one way to describe it. He covered his face again. Why didn't you tell me? Vessa watched him with quiet patience. Because you would have behaved differently. Daniel lowered his hand slowly. Yes, he said. That is correct. I absolutely would have. Exactly. He thought about that for a moment. You mean I would have been polite? You would have been careful. Well, yes. An honest conversation becomes difficult when everyone is careful. Daniel considered that. He looked around again at the distant guards and the citizens pretending not to watch them. Then he looked back at her. So this whole time, he said slowly, you were just walking around the city pretending to be a normal person? I was walking around the city being a normal person. Daniel stared at her. You are the queen. Yes. That is not normal. It is complicated. Daniel sighed and rubbed his temples. Okay, he said. New question. Yes? How many times today did I accidentally insult the crown? Vessa tilted her head thoughtfully. 3 times. Only 3? 4 if you include the cape theory. Daniel groaned again. That one was my favorite. Vessa laughed softly. The sound was the same warm laugh he had heard all afternoon, but now Daniel understood something he hadn't realized before. It was the laugh of someone who almost never got to hear honest jokes. He looked at her again, still processing the situation. So, let me confirm this, he said. I am a tourist from Earth. Yes. And you, the Queen, decided to personally guide me through the city in disguise. Yes. And the entire time I had no idea. That is correct. Daniel sighed deeply. Well, he said, glancing around the enormous plaza, this vacation just became significantly more complicated. They left the plaza slowly. Daniel walked beside Vessa in silence for nearly a full minute, which for him was an impressive personal achievement. Normally, his thoughts came out of his mouth almost immediately, But at the moment, his brain was busy reorganizing everything that had happened in the last several hours. The streets of Leth continued to glow with life around them. Markets resumed their noise. Transport vehicles glided quietly overhead, and floating lanterns drifted between the tall buildings. Yet something subtle had changed. Citizens who passed them now bowed their heads briefly. Some stepped aside to clear a path. Others pretended not to notice anything unusual at all. Daniel noticed all of it. He leaned closer to Vessa. "Okay," he whispered. "I think I understand why the guards were watching us. They were not watching you." "Oh, that's comforting." "They were watching me." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, that makes more sense." They turned into a quieter street where the market noise softened into distant echoes. The buildings here were taller and more refined, their surfaces made of smooth metallic stone that reflected the evening light. Daniel finally stopped walking. "All right," he said, folding his arms. "I need to ask several very important questions before my brain overheats." Vessa stopped with him, calm as ever. "Go ahead," Daniel pointed at her. "First question, how long have you been, you know, the Queen?" "8 years." Daniel blinked. 8 years? "Yes. And during those 8 years you've been sneaking out of the palace pretending to be a tour guide?" "Occasionally. Occasionally. Whenever I need to think clearly." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That might be the most dangerous hobby I've ever heard." Vessa raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Because what if someone recognizes you?" "Many do." Daniel stared at her. "That doesn't concern you." "It depends who recognizes me." He paused. "That answer is not reassuring." They continued walking again. A small floating maintenance drone drifted along the street beside them, scanning the pavement with a faint blue light. Daniel pointed at it. "Does that one report directly to you?" "No." "Good," he said. "Because I said some things about your architecture earlier that might sound suspicious in a political context." Vessa smiled faintly. "I found your observations interesting." "That's because you have a sense of humor," Daniel said. "Your advisors might not." At the mention of advisors, Vessa's expression changed slightly. "Advisors rarely speak honestly," she said. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. "Why?" "Because they are afraid of being wrong." "That's unfortunate," Daniel said. "Yes." They reached a wide balcony overlooking another district of the city. Below them, layers of streets and markets stretched into the distance like glowing rivers of movement. Daniel leaned against the railing. "You know," he said, "I think I understand something now." "What is that?" "You weren't showing me the city because I was a tourist." Vessa looked at him. "No. You were testing something." She considered the thought for a moment. "Perhaps." Daniel watched the moving lights of the city below. "People treat you differently when they know you're the Queen." "Yes. They probably agree with everything you say." "Most of the time." "That must be exhausting." "It can be." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Back on Earth," he said, "I once worked for a company where nobody wanted to disagree with the boss." "And what happened?" "The company collapsed in 3 years." Vessa looked amused. "That is unfortunate." "It was very educational." He turned to face her again. "So when you met me," he continued, "you realized something." "And what was that?" "That I had absolutely no idea who you were." "That was obvious." "And because of that," Daniel said, "I kept talking like a normal person." "You did." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I also criticized half the city." "Yes." "And made jokes about your statues." "Yes." "And compared your political architecture to dramatic capes." "That was memorable." Daniel sighed. "And instead of arresting me, you kept walking around the market with me." "Yes." He looked at her carefully now. "You liked it." Vessa didn't answer immediately. The wind moved softly across the balcony, carrying distant sounds of the city. Finally, she nodded. "Yes." Daniel laughed quietly. "So the queen of an alien world escaped the palace to find someone who would argue with her about public infrastructure. When you say it like that, it sounds strange." "It is strange." She stepped closer to the railing beside him. "For years," she said, "every conversation I have had has been careful. Every word measured." Daniel nodded. That sounds exhausting. It is. But with you, she continued, the conversation was simple. Daniel grinned slightly. You mean reckless? Honest? He shrugged. Those two things are sometimes the same. They stood there quietly for a moment, watching the endless city of Leth glow beneath them. Then Daniel suddenly straightened. Oh, Vessa glanced at him. What? He pointed at himself. Wait a second. Yes? If you're the queen, and we've been walking around together all afternoon? Yes? That means the entire city now thinks I'm... What exactly? Vessa considered that question carefully. Then she smiled. That depends on what rumors they invent. Daniel groaned. Fantastic. He leaned back against the railing again. I came here for a vacation, he said, and instead, I accidentally became friends with the most powerful person on the planet. Vessa looked at him thoughtfully. Does that bother you? Daniel thought about it. Then he shook his head. No, he said. It just means I should probably be more careful about my jokes. They remained on the balcony for a long time, watching the city breathe beneath them. From above, Leth looked less like a city and more like a living organism. Streams of light marked transport lanes gliding between towers. Hovering cargo platforms moved slowly between districts like patient mechanical animals. Far below, the market shimmered with thousands of shifting lights. Daniel leaned forward on the railing. I'm starting to understand why you sneak out, he said. Vessa glanced at him. You are. Up here, everything looks organized, clean, perfect. And below? Below, it's messy, Daniel said. People arguing over prices, pastries trying to electrocute tourists, small cubes debating philosophy. That cube was discussing storage efficiency. That's exactly the kind of sentence that concerns me. Vessa smiled slightly. The evening light deepened across the city. Some of the buildings began activating their illumination systems, lines of gentle blue and gold appearing along their surfaces like glowing veins. Daniel noticed something moving far in the sky. A massive ship drifted slowly above the upper transport lanes. Its hull shimmered with layered panels, and its engines emitted a soft gravitational distortion that bent the air around it. Daniel straightened. Okay, he said, pointing upward. Now that looks important. Vessa followed his gaze. It is a diplomatic cruiser. Diplomatic? Yes. Daniel watched the enormous vessel carefully. That ship is bigger than my apartment building. That is a very small apartment building. It's a metaphor, Daniel said. The cruiser glided toward a distant tower where an enormous circular platform extended from the structure like a metallic flower. Daniel whistled softly. I'm guessing that kind of traffic happens near the palace all the time. It does. Which reminds me, Daniel added carefully, I still haven't actually seen the palace. You will. Daniel looked at her suspiciously. That sounded like a statement with hidden consequences. Vessa rested her hands lightly on the railing. Daniel. Yes? Earlier today you said something interesting. That happens sometimes. You said that on Earth, leaders who only hear agreement eventually make poor decisions. Daniel nodded slowly. That's true. You believe disagreement is useful. Constructive disagreement, Daniel corrected. The kind where people argue because they want something to improve. Vessa was quiet for a moment. Down in the streets, a transport convoy passed, its anti-gravity engines humming softly as it carried large cargo containers between districts. Finally, she spoke again. That is difficult to find. Daniel looked at her. Honest people? Yes. Well, he said, scratching his chin, honesty becomes dangerous when people think you're powerful. That is exactly the problem. He thought about that. So in the palace, everyone filters their opinions. Yes, they say what you want to hear, or what they believe will protect them. Daniel sighed. That's not great for decision-making. No. A small security drone drifted quietly along the balcony wall before continuing down the corridor behind them. Its sensors glowed briefly as it passed. Daniel watched it go. I assume those things report directly to palace security. Yes. And they know exactly where you are right now. Yes. Daniel laughed quietly. Your secret trips into the city are not very secret, are they? They are secret from most people, except the ones with drones. They are trusted, Daniel nodded. Fair enough. He leaned against the railing again, looking thoughtful. So let me ask something important. Vessa turned slightly toward him. What is it? When you brought me into the market today, did you already know who I was? Yes, Daniel blinked. You did? You arrived on a diplomatic tourist visa. I read the report. That report probably made me sound very responsible. It described you as curious. That's diplomatic language for talks too much, Daniel said. Vessa did not disagree. He watched the distant cruiser disappear into the docking platform before speaking again. And after meeting me, he continued, you decided to spend the afternoon listening to my opinions about pastries and architecture. You also criticized our traffic patterns. Those lanes are confusing. They were designed by mathematicians. That explains everything. Vessa laughed quietly. Daniel studied her expression for a moment. You enjoyed it? Yes. He nodded slowly. That's the strange part. What is? You're the queen of an entire civilization, and you enjoyed spending the afternoon arguing with a tourist about city planning. That tourist was honest. Daniel considered that. Then he straightened suddenly. Oh, Vessa raised an eyebrow. What? Daniel pointed between them. Wait. Yes? You're not just telling me this because you enjoy casual conversation, are you? She said nothing. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Oh, no. What? You're about to ask me something. Vessa looked calmly at the city. Perhaps. Daniel crossed his arms. I knew it. This is the moment where the queen asks the confused tourist for a favor. It is not a favor. Then what is it? She turned to face him fully now. A proposal. Daniel groaned quietly. That word is rarely simple. I would like you to stay on Arien for a while. He blinked. Stay? Yes. And do what exactly? Vessa's expression was thoughtful but steady. Continue doing what you did today. Daniel waited. That is extremely vague. I would like you to speak honestly. He stared at her. That's the job? Yes. Daniel looked around the enormous glowing city, then back at the queen standing beside him. You want me, a tourist, to casually give opinions about your civilization? Yes. That sounds suspiciously like being an advisor. Unofficially, Daniel rubbed his forehead, I came here for sightseeing. And now, he sighed, now I'm apparently interviewing for the strangest job in the galaxy. Daniel did not answer immediately. He leaned against the balcony railing and looked down at the immense city again. From this height, Leth seemed endless. Rivers of light flowing through avenues, small transport craft weaving quietly between towers, distant markets still glowing with life. Somewhere down there, a vendor was probably still selling mildly electrified pastries. He exhaled slowly. So let me make sure I understand the situation, he said. Vessa waited patiently. You're offering me the chance to stay on an alien planet, Daniel continued, counting on his fingers. Talk freely to the queen of that planet, criticize city planning without being arrested, and occasionally help improve things. Yes, Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That is either the best opportunity of my life or a very elaborate trap. Vessa tilted her head. If it were a trap, you would already be in a dungeon. That's a good point, Daniel admitted. They stood quietly for a moment. Below them, a convoy of floating cargo carriers drifted slowly through the air like glowing whales. The city continued its endless movement, unaware that one slightly confused tourist was currently deciding whether to accidentally become part of its political system. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. You know what worries me? What? You might start listening to my ideas. That is the intention. That's the dangerous part. Vessa's expression softened slightly. Why? Daniel shrugged. Because I'm not a politician. I'm not a strategist. I'm just someone who notices when sidewalks move or pastries try to electrocute people. That perspective is valuable. He laughed quietly. Most civilizations probably don't base policy on pastry safety. Perhaps they should. Daniel thought about that. Then he looked back at her. You're serious about this? Yes. And your advisors won't hate me? They might. That's honest, Daniel said. They will dislike that you speak without fear. Well, Daniel replied, fear tends to make conversations boring. Vessa considered that. Yes. The wind shifted slightly across the balcony as nightlights slowly awakened across the city. Towers lit up one by one, their surfaces glowing with calm geometric patterns. Daniel watched the lights spread. You know, he said quietly, when I first arrived here today, I thought this trip would just be sightseeing. And now? Now I've discovered something strange. What? That even on another planet, leadership still has the same problem. Vessa raised an eyebrow. Which is? Loneliness. She did not answer immediately. Daniel continued. People stop talking honestly to you. They start performing. Everything becomes careful. That is true. And the funny thing is, Daniel said, the only reason I didn't do that was because I had no idea who you were. That is why today mattered. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I understand that now. They stood there quietly again, watching the city of Arien. Finally, Daniel pushed himself away from the railing. All right. Vessa looked at him. That sounded like a decision. It is. And? Daniel stretched his arms. I'll stay for a while. A faint smile appeared on her face. You will? Yes, he said. But we need to establish some rules. Rules? Very important ones. Vessa crossed her arms with interest. I am listening. Daniel held up one finger. First rule. If I say something stupid, you are not allowed to execute me. That seems reasonable. Second rule. You must occasionally continue sneaking out of the palace. Why? Because if we only talk in royal meeting rooms, everything will become boring again. Vessa considered that. I agree. Daniel held up a third finger. And third rule. Yes? If any pastry in this city becomes more dangerous than the one I already ate, you have to warn me first. For a moment, the Queen of Aryan simply stared at him. Then she laughed. Not the quiet, controlled laugh of a ruler surrounded by formality. A real one. The kind Daniel had heard earlier in the markets. You have my word, she said. Below them, the city continued its endless movement. Ships arriving, markets glowing, citizens walking through streets filled with light. For the first time since learning the truth, Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle into something calmer. He had arrived on Arien as a tourist. Now he was something else. Not a politician, not an official advisor. Just a man who spoke honestly to a queen who needed to hear it. Daniel glanced at the glowing city one more time. You know, he said casually, I still think some of your statues need less dramatic capes. Vessa smiled. Then we have much work ahead of us.